to the National Constitution Center's online classes. I am Jenna. I am the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the center, and I am here with one of our top scholars, Tom Donnelly. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Jenna, great to be here with you.
Yeah, so Warren reminded us in the chat that today is James Madison's birthday. Happy birthday to James Madison, father of the Constitution. And what a more perfect topic to talk about on his birthday than the Constitutional Convention. So that will be today's topic of conversation. We have a lot to get through, like Tom was saying just a second ago. It's a lot to get through in 30 minutes, the Constitutional Convention, but we're going to look at why the founding generation decided to write a new constitution, how did it differ from the Articles of Confederation, and also what were some of the compromises, the debates and the compromises that were reached at the Constitutional Convention. So just kind of the big idea today, though, is looking at those the Constitution, how the convention. Those important parts of the convention. But before we get to that, Tom, do we want to do a quick walkthrough of the Constitution? What is it? What's involved in it? And then we'll kind of go back to where it came from, how we got here.
That sounds great, Jenna. Yeah, the Constitution, it's not a particularly long document. And so we'll just take a little quick walking tour through it. So the Constitution is composed of a preamble, 7 articles, and 27 amendments. And the Constitution begins with the phrase, "We the people," one of the most inspiring phrases in all of American history. And what the preamble is getting at is the deep principle of popular sovereignty. It's the idea that the foundation of our government, the foundation of our Constitution is with us, we the people, not a king, not a monarch, not an aristocracy, not an oligarchy, not a dictator, but it's driven by us, the American people. So that's the inspiring words of the preamble. Once you get through the preamble, then you have the first 3 articles of the Constitution where the founding generation establishes the 3 branches of government. So Article 1 gives us the legislative branch, Congress, which is tasked with making the laws. Article 2 lays out the executive branch led by a single president responsible for enforcing the laws. And Article 3 outlines the judicial branch, with the Supreme Court as the highest court with the duty to interpret the laws. It's a nice, logical organization to the Constitution. We can thank Gouverneur Morris, who was the delegate from Pennsylvania, who helped construct and structure the Constitution and place it in this way where we can really understand and make sense of where different items go. But that's Articles 1 through 3. I'll pause there, Jenna, before getting to the rest of the Constitution.
Yeah, so I think that this is great. Kind of having that structure is so helpful, and having each of those roles defined, but also because they're not individual bubbles, they all interact with each other as well. So that's really great to kind of have those right off the bat. But there are a couple more articles of the Constitution. So what do the rest of them do? Now that we've got the government established, what do the rest of those articles of the Constitution do?
Absolutely. So 1, 2, 3, they give us the structure of government, the 3 branches of government. Articles 4 through 7 fill out some other important details. Article 4, it's a bit of a hodgepodge, honestly, but what it's really doing is it addresses the relationship between the states and their citizens, the relationship between the states, how to handle the admission of new states. The idea was that we're gonna be this big country, we might add new states, and so it gave us a process for that, and also how to govern federal territories. Article 4 also includes the infamous fugitive slave clause. And then once we get to Article 4, Article 5 sets out the process for amending the Constitution. And this is such a cool part of the Constitution. It's that as brilliant as the founders were, as amazing as the Constitution is, the founders didn't believe they had a monopoly on constitutional wisdom. They learned from history, they learned from their own experiences. They wanted us to do the same. And Article 5 gives us a process for updating the Constitution over time and adopting new lessons and making the Constitution better, forming a more perfect union. Article 6 establishes the supremacy of national law over the laws of the states, and it also bans religious tests for national office. And then finally, Article 7 sets out the process for ratifying the Constitution. We may not think much about this article today. It tells us that the Constitution goes into effect when 9 states approve it at the time. But what's so cool about this, Jenna, is it tells us that it really didn't matter that George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, these brilliant framers that were there at the Constitutional Convention, it didn't just matter that they wrote the document, they then sent it back to the American people to say yes or no. And so that's that process of ratification, that process of the American people saying yes or no. We almost said no. It was a really, really close fight over ratification, but it's a reminder again, Article 7, this ratification process is a reminder of that deep principle we spoke of at the beginning, popular sovereignty. In the end, the decision whether or not to adopt that new Constitution, it's with us.
Yeah, I love that Article 7 kind of brings it full circle, bringing back to those words, we the people, that popular sovereignty. You have to, this is our document. We have to accept it kind of and buy in to the Constitution. And that was the ratification process. Wow, thanks, Tom. That was a really great look at the Constitution. But I do, and I think we're going to go through kind of how they got to the articles that they put in the Constitution, in a little bit. But I want to get to sort of how we got here, because we were talking about ratification, the amendment process. That all came because we were having trouble with our original governing document, right? It wasn't quite working. So can you tell us a little bit about the Articles of Confederation and where it came from, what it is, and then why we decided we needed to move on from it?
Yeah, so we declare independence in 1776. The Constitutional Convention isn't until 1787, and a lot happens in that little over a decade. Part of it is it's this exciting moment of constitutional experimentation and creativity. We create a framework of national government, the Articles of Confederation. We write state constitutions state by state, and so the founding generation, even before the Constitutional Convention itself, is creating new frameworks of government. And importantly, the founding generation learns from these experiences. So first, let's say a little bit about the Articles of Confederation. This is the framework of government that we have before the Constitution. It establishes this national framework of government. If there's one thing to remember about the Articles of Confederation, it's that it creates a weak national government. The states are retaining a lot of the power, very little power is given to the national government. The Articles of Confederation itself refers to itself as a league of friendship between the states. And so one way of thinking of the Articles of Confederation is that it sets up a government that's almost more like the United Nations than the United States of America. So it's a weak framework of government, but the Articles have certain features that the founders learned from. So one is the Articles created a national government that was centered on the legislative branch. So there's only one branch of government in this new Articles of Confederation, Congress. Congress itself is only a single house. There's one house of Congress. And the way political power is structured is that each state, whether there's a lot of people in the state or not a lot of people in the state, every state gets one vote. And so that's the basic structure of the Articles of Confederation. As to the powers of the Articles of Confederation, the Articles of Confederation really, they didn't give the national government a lot of the powers we would usually think a national government would have. So under the Articles, the national government didn't have the power to tax or to regulate business between the states. It couldn't force the states to provide troops or send the government money. And then importantly, any proposed amendment to the Articles of Confederation required unanimous approval of all 13 states. So even as the Articles of Confederation proved flawed over time, the amendment process was really, really hard. Every state had to say yes to a new amendment before amending the Articles of Confederation. And because of that, we never amended it. And so during this period, Jenna, what we end up seeing is the founding generations they have this Articles of Confederation, they're testing it out. It's a weak framework of government. Power is being kept in the states. And ultimately, a lot of people, both people who support and oppose the new Constitution eventually, look at the Articles and say, this is flawed. We want to change it. But because of this amendment process being really, really difficult, they weren't able to address all of those flaws.
That's such a good point to kind of we have this document, it's not working and we can't fix it. So what are we going to do? And it is also important to think of those different states, governments, they kind of acted a little differently at the time, right? It was the states back then didn't look like they do now. They had a little bit more power, right?
Yeah, so the Articles, so when the founders are moving towards the Constitutional Convention, one thing they're addressing are the flaws of the Articles of Confederation. The other thing they're looking at, though, are the state governments that they create. So after we declare independence, Congress says, state governments, write new constitutions. And so this is an amazingly exciting period of constitutional creativity where we're creating constitutions for each of the states. But what we do is, through these constitutions, the founding generation concludes that they made some mistakes. And so if you're looking at these state constitutions, what did they do? Well, they gave almost all power to the state legislatures. But because of this, we have weak governors and weak state courts. And so the power in those state governments was seen as out of balance. So if we're looking at the Constitution that we ultimately write, the US Constitution, part of what they're responding to is what from these state governments, seeing what happens when we give state legislatures too much power, when we give the legislative branch too much power, and don't have sufficient checks from the executive branch, the governor, or in the judicial branch, the courts. And so what they learned during this period is we see states passing policies that a lot of people questioned. And so they're setting up barriers of trade between the states. They're passing laws that undermine property rights. And over time, many of the founders look at these state governments and they say, these governments gave too much power to the legislatures and they passed lousy policies. And because of this, the American economy begins a downturn, which brings us ultimately here to one of the precipitating events of the Constitutional Convention, Shay's Rebellion. Should we say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was gonna go next. Okay, so we've got a kind of a weak national government that can't get a lot done, and then these like stronger states that are putting the emphasis on the legislature. So like that kind of all comes to a head with Shay's Rebellion. So kind of set the stage for us with Shay's Rebellion, and how did that lead to the Constitutional Convention?
Yeah, so it's late 1786, and so farmers in Western Massachusetts are really upset. They're facing high land taxes and a feeling that the economic and governing elite in Boston don't hear their concerns. And so there's this uprising in Western Pennsylvania. Who is Shays? Well, it's Daniel Shays. He's a 39-year-old farmer, but he was a veteran of the American Revolution. He fought at Lexington, he fought at Bunker Hill. And so he organizes these farmers in Western Massachusetts to respond to what they see as the problems of policy in Massachusetts. And so they march across the state. They seize control of court buildings, preventing state governments from taking possession of their farms. They force debtors' prisons to close. They attempt to attack they want to get the arsenal of the state from Springfield, Massachusetts. Their goal is to march on Boston. They want to march from Western Massachusetts to Boston because they want the Massachusetts government to hear their concerns. They didn't think the governing elite were listening to them, so they were trying to get them to take notice. Under the Articles of Confederation, though, Congress had no power to raise an army to deal with this essentially mob violence. And so it's not a national force that puts down this rebellion, but it's ultimately a Massachusetts militia. And so for George Washington, for Alexander Hamilton, for the birthday boy, James Madison, this is terrifying. The idea here is that there was nothing special about Shay's Rebellion that said that it's this, and then we have a constitutional convention. But in the end, for this generation of leaders, they're concerned that this is the threat of mob rule. Is this going to be the first uprising among many? And furthermore, when we have a national government here that can't put down the rebellion, but also doesn't have the power to address genuinely national problems, that's a problem. We have no real way to take this flawed Articles of Confederation and amend it. And so they conclude that we need a new framework of government. So they push for a constitutional convention that ultimately will give rise to the US Constitution.
Okay, so that's a good point to remember. The Shays Rebellion didn't necessarily bring about the Constitutional Convention on its own. It just kind of was this great example of why we needed one, and at that moment was kind of the last straw on the scale that made these leaders call for a convention. So they call for the convention, Philadelphia, 1787. Who was there? Why? What were they going to talk about? What was the goal of the convention?
Yeah, so Congress calls this convention in Philadelphia for September for the, quote, sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. But, we have key delegates that show up to the convention with bigger plans. Delegates like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, they want a new framework of government. And so you can see here, this is the room where it happened. These are the key delegates. And a couple things are noteworthy just looking at this picture. First, who's in the room? Well, we see at the front of the room there, George Washington. We see sitting down in that turquoise blue leisure suit there, Benjamin Franklin. And what this tells us, these are the two biggest figures in America. These are the most globally famous figures in America. These are the most beloved figures in America. And so their very presence in the room tells the world something big is happening here. And it took a lot of convincing to get George Washington into that room. He thought he had done enough. He was ready to retire. And it took James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, many of his friends to say, no, we know there are big problems in the country right now. You've done so much to form America. You have to be there. You have to be in Philadelphia to oversee this convention and let people know that something important is happening. If we're looking at just some of the facts and figures of the Constitutional Convention, it met in secret in Philadelphia from May 1787 to September 1787. It met at the Pennsylvania State House, which we now call Independence Hall. If you're actually at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, you can see Independence Hall right out of our front door.
Amazing view.
It's so cool. Like being able to commute into work and just walk into the building, just turn around and say, "Oh, hello, Independence Hall." It's a nice perk of the job. You know, delegates are nominated and appointed by their respective state legislatures. 12 of 13 states were represented in the convention. Rhode Island never sent a delegation. They feared a strong national government. They said, "Nope, we're not going to take on this project." The delegations themselves, they each had one vote per state. And so again, whether you have not a lot of people in your state or a lot of people in your state, each state gets one vote in the convention. On the final day of the convention, 3 delegates, Elbridge Gerry, George Mason, and Edmund Randolph, refused to sign the Constitution. And we affectionately refer to them as the dissenters. And then, the final thing to note is who's not at this convention. There are a couple famous figures that are not at this convention. Thomas Jefferson isn't. He's in France. John Adams isn't. He's in England. So they're serving America abroad, but they're not here for this amazing moment in American history. John Hancock's the governor of Massachusetts. He's the one with the big signature on the Declaration of Independence. And importantly, defenders of state power and critics of strong national government like Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry of Virginia, they refused to attend the convention. And so there are some powerful voices that might have pushed back at some features of the Constitution that simply weren't there at the convention.
Yeah, if the view of Independence Hall is one of the best things about the Constitution Center, another one definitely is Signers Hall, which is the room with the statues. And that's always our number one question. Where's Thomas Jefferson? Where's, John Adams? Where is the Rhode Island delegation? And so it really gives us a great opportunity in the museum to talk about it. So I'm glad we can do that here too today. So we have the convention. Obviously, they've decided that they're going to probably throw out their Articles of Confederation and create a new constitution, but they had some big issues to work out. So what were the big debates at the convention, and kind of how did we resolve each one of those debates? I have them kind of listed here and we can go through them one by one.
Yeah, so we'll tick through these big compromises. There's the Connecticut or Great Compromise. We'll talk about the compromise over the presidency and the Electoral College. And then we'll talk about 2 of the tragic compromises over the institution of slavery, the 3/5 Compromise and the slave trade clause. But let's start with the Connecticut or Great Compromise. So what's going on here? What's the big debate? Well, this is the big debate between the big states and the small states. So we have the states with more people, with a lot of people, and states with not a lot of people. And what they're arguing about here is, how are we going to organize political power in Congress? How are we going to decide how many seats each state gets in Congress? And so we end up seeing this debate organized around 2 big plans. The first plan is the Virginia Plan, which was the brainchild of James Madison. It was organized before the convention. It was this big plan. It wasn't just about Congress. It laid out all of the features of the government that the Virginia delegation supported. But for our purposes, what the Virginia Plan said about Congress is, 1, we're going to have 2 houses in Congress. That's what the Virginia Plan said. So remember, the Articles of Confederation, it only had 1 house in Congress. What the Virginia Plan says is, no, we want to divide power in Congress between 2 houses. Why? Because the founding generation feared that Congress was going to be the most powerful branch of the national government. And because of that, they thought it would be safer to divide power into 2 separate houses. The other big thing the Virginia Plan said is, when you're organizing political power in each of those houses of Congress, you should organize it by population. So if you're a bigger state with more people, you should have more seats in Congress than a smaller state with fewer people. So this is different than the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was organized around the principle of equal state representation. So no matter the size of the state, they each had the same number of votes. So the Virginia Plan is rebalancing power in that way. So that's the Virginia Plan. That's James Madison. That's the Virginia delegation. Well, the small states don't like this plan. The Virginia Plan is great if you're a big state. If you're a small state, it's pretty lousy. And so we have William Patterson come forth with the New Jersey Plan. And the key thing the New Jersey Plan does is it doesn't really change that key feature of the Articles of Confederation that has to do with representation and political power. The New Jersey Plan says we should have a one-house legislature, so a Congress of 1 house, just like the Articles of Confederation. And each state, regardless of its size, should receive 1 vote, so also like the Articles of Confederation. So these are 2 plans. The Virginia Plan based on population, the New Jersey Plan based on equal state representation, each state getting the same number of votes, the same amount of political power. And in the end, there's a compromise brokered between the 2 delegates of Connecticut, hence calling it the Connecticut Compromise. These key delegates are Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth. And what they effectively do is they split the difference. They say we're going to have two houses of Congress. So Virginia plan, we're going to take that from you, but we're going to organize those two houses of Congress differently. The US House of Representatives, we're going to organize that by population. So if states have more people, they get more seats in the US House of Representatives. But the Senate, we're going to organize under the principle of equal state representation. Each state, no matter its size, is going to get two votes. But in the end, we often think of compromise as everyone coming together. This plan, this compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, the Great Compromise, it passed by one vote. One vote. So it was a really, really close vote. And frankly, the birthday boy, James Madison, was outraged. He hated the Connecticut Compromise. He thought the Virginia plan had it right. But in the end, he accepted the results and would even defend the structure when he would later write key essays in the Federalist Papers.
Right. So he eventually did, go all defend this compromise, even though it wasn't his original vision for the Constitution.
He lost. He lost on this one.
All right, so that's one compromise down. We have about 10 minutes left to get through the next three. So let's talk about the presidency.
Yeah, so the presidency, we're going to focus on the compromise there, especially over the Electoral College, the way we select a president. The presidency it's the one part of the government where the founders really struggled with what they wanted to do with the presidency. Part of it was that they didn't see an example of what they wanted out there in the world or in history. So they would look to Europe and they would see powerful kings. They said, no, tried that. We don't want that. On the other hand, they looked at their own state constitutions and they saw weak governors. Because remember, those state constitutions had strong state legislatures, weak governors. They said, no, those governors, that amount of power, it wouldn't work for the national government. So they wanted something in between sort of a really powerful king and a really weak governor. And so in the end, what they end up doing is that they have big debates over a series of issues. And these are issues like how to elect the president, how long the president's term should be, whether the president should be allowed to run for re-election, and the question of impeachment and removal. And each of these issues, what the framers noticed was once they changed their mind on one of them, they would change their minds about other ones. And so it was really a moving target to figure out what to do with the presidency. And delegates had real competing views about what the president should look like. There were delegates like Alexander Hamilton and John Dickinson who looked at the British crown and said, something like an elected king, not a bad idea. And so they really supported a very strong president. We had other delegates like Roger Sherman of Connecticut, who really didn't want the president to do much of anything. He just wanted the president to be there to serve Congress. And so what he said is he wanted a president that was nothing more than an institution for carrying the will of Congress into effect. And so the delegates go back and forth, and we see these debates, bubble up as we're deciding, not only what should the president look like, how much power should the president have, but how are we going to select the president? And so in the end, the founders come up with a bunch of different ideas. James Wilson of Pennsylvania, in many ways, inspired a lot of features of the American presidency. He supported direct election by popular vote. So he wanted a popular vote for the presidency. Didn't get a lot of support at the convention. Some were like, no, that's a bridge too far. But we had that idea out there. Many of the delegates supported election by Congress, so that Congress would select the presidency. So, if you select by popular vote, the benefit is you're rooting the presidency in popular sovereignty, the election by the voters. If you're electing a president by Congress, the key advantage for the convention delegates, they thought if we have Congress select the president, we're then having the president selected by some of the most knowledgeable members in the nation. And so there's this idea that we'll get the best decisions made by Congress because they'll be the most knowledgeable electors. But in both cases, they're dealing with a problem we don't think about a lot today, which is how do you select a president when most people never leave their hometown, never leave their state? Really, a lot of politics is structured around the states. And so how are we going to decide a leader of a nation when most voters, most ordinary Americans aren't going to know anyone outside their town or at best their state? And so in the end, what we come up with is this idea of an electoral college. And so it's sort of a compromise between, the popular vote and a selection by the Congress. And so what it does is it says, we're going to have a separate body called the Electoral College. How are we going to determine how are we going to determine how many electors there are? Well, each state is going to get a number of electors that's equal to the members of Congress they get. So if they have 3 members in the House, 2 in the Senate, they then get 5 electoral votes. And what happens is, over time, we Americans end up voting on Election Day in November, but effectively what we're voting for are a slate of electors that will formally meet in December. to select the president. And if a candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College, they become the president, even if they don't get a majority of the popular vote. And if no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College, then it's going to be decided, the presidency is going to be decided by the US House of Representatives. So the Electoral College had this benefit of, it did allow for some popular input if the states allowed for it for the electors that are selected into the Electoral College. At the same time, it did present the possibility of having this separate body of electors reach independent decisions. But importantly, it also ensured that the president's base of political support wasn't just from members of Congress, but that there's a separate body that the president is drawing the political support from. So the president himself or herself can still serve as a check on Congress. The concern is if Congress is going to select the presidency, the president's never really going to really stand up to Congress. And the Electoral College helps solve that problem as well.
Yeah, I think maybe that gets into a little bit. Warren asked a question, or was it Uriel asked a question about why we didn't go with a parliamentary system of having that kind of prime minister from the, from the body of Congress. So is that kind of why, because we wanted to have that check and balance?
Well, yeah. So Roger Sherman's idea was basically to have something kind of like almost very close to like a prime minister system. But the idea, and this I think grows out of our experience of both the articles and the state constitutions, is we don't want to lodge too much power in any one branch of government. There's the idea we want a national government that's going to be able to get some stuff done if we can come together to do things at the national level. But in the end, we don't really trust any branch to speak perfectly for the people or to act wisely. And so we wanted to divide power and have certain institutions in government that were going to check Congress. Because again, the assumption is Congress is going to be the most powerful branch. Because of that, we wanted to at least have the possibility of checks by the president and possibly checks by the courts as well.
Yeah. Okay. So again, Electoral College, not everybody got what they wanted. It was, again, a compromise, but people saw some advantages, and thought that maybe it might work out for them in different situations. So again, a compromise, not everybody's getting what they want, but it's built into the Constitution, right? All right, so let's pivot now to some of the tougher compromises to talk about, and those are the ones dealing with slavery.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about two big compromises here, the compromise over the 3/5 clause and over the slave trade clause. I mean, one thing to note is obviously the institution of slavery, it's older than the US Constitution. It was written into colonial laws as early as the 1660s in places like Virginia and the Carolinas. And in the 1700s, we see the American slavery expands. And so if we're looking at the Constitutional Convention, what role did the debates over slavery play there? Well, all told, 25 of the 55 delegates held enslaved people. And for these delegates, slavery ends up being a key source of this delegate's wealth and the economics of their home state. If we're looking at the Constitution as a whole, what can we say, about the compromises over this institution? Well, one is that the framers worked hard not to write the word slave or slavery into the Constitution. They also ensured that there was no explicit recognition of what was known as the right to property in men. But at the same time, they made key compromises with many of these slaveholding states, putting in important protections for the slave power and slaveholding interests in the Constitution itself, and also left the broader question of whether to permit the institution of slavery, yes or no, to the states. And so this wound up being something that was left to state decision-making. We're looking at the big compromises here over the institution of slavery. The most important one, probably practically speaking, was what's known as the 3/5 compromise. So again, we're going back to this question of how are we going to organize political power in Congress? And the question becomes, for the US House of Representatives, where we're organizing the seats by the population of the states, how do we count enslaved people for purposes of determining how many seats a given state is going to get in the House of Representatives? The slaveholding states argue that enslaved people should count as 5/5 as a full person. And so although they give enslaved people no rights at all, they want to try to use the presence of enslaved people in their state and this system of slavery to boost their political power in Congress. At the same time, you see anti-slavery delegates step in and say, no, that makes no sense. You treat enslaved people, you don't treat them as human beings. You don't grant them any rights. You treat them deplorably. How in the world should you get a boost in your political power based on how many people you enslave? And so for anti-slavery delegates like Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, they argue that no, enslaved people shouldn't count for purposes of representation in Congress. And effectively, slaveholding states shouldn't get a bonus for holding people in enslavement. And so there's this big debate between should it be 5/5, should be 0/5. It ends up having some really powerful arguments on the floor of the convention where, for instance, Gouverneur Morris calls the institution of slavery a, quote, nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Ultimately, again, the delegates broker a compromise here and end up settling on the idea that enslaved people will count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in Congress. So in effect, boosting the political power of the slaveholding states for the amount of people that they enslave. And this has a huge rippling effect over time to how political power is structured in policy in the United States, as it increases the pro-slavery strength in Congress by counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, in the presidency, because that then in turn boosts the amount of electors that the slaveholding states are getting. And ultimately, it also shapes the Supreme Court through electing more pro-slavery presidents who then appoint the people on the Supreme Court. So this is a compromise that has a huge rippling effect throughout American history.
Yeah, and I think it is important to continually remember that it is for the purposes of representation, because it's a little strange to think about it. It's the people that were really pro-abolition, anti-slavery, that were arguing for them to be counted as less than a full person for the purposes of representation. But that was because they knew that that would give such a huge advantage to the slaveholding states. And so that's why they were making that argument, even though they were pro-abolition and against the institution of slavery. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, what Gouverneur Moore says, he says, upon what principle is it that an enslaved person should be computed in the representation? Are they people? Then make them citizens and let them vote. And so Gouverneur Morris just dealt with that directly. But you're right, it is a bit jarring to read those debates for precisely the reason you said, Jenna.
Right. And then finally, we look at that slave trade clause and how long slavery, the institution of slavery, would continue. Would we end it altogether? Would we continue let it continue but end the slave trade? So what were the debates around there?
Yeah, so the slave trade clause in particular has to do with the international slave trade. So taking people, enslaving them in Africa and transporting them across the Atlantic in brutal conditions to be enslaved here in the United States. And what the slave trade clause ultimately says is that Congress has no power to affect the international slave trade until 1808. And so that's effectively, it sets a time period in which Congress cannot touch the international slave trade. And this is a hard fought compromise. We had delegates from the deep South, from places like South Carolina and Georgia, determined to say Congress should never have any power over the international slave trade. And these states, they threatened to walk out of the convention if they don't win on this debate. On the other hand, you see delegates both from the North, but also from the Upper South and places like Virginia. So people who held enslaved people like George Mason, still arguing that the international slave trade is a particularly brutal feature of the institution of slavery. And so arguing that we should just get rid of the international slave trade altogether. And in the end, again, the delegates come together, they reach a compromise, and what they say is, we're going to take away Congress's power to abolish the international slave trade, but only until 1808. In 1808, Congress can then abolish the international slave trade. This has a huge practical effect because in the intervening years between 1788 and 1808, we end up having another 200,000 enslaved people brought into the United States. So this has a huge practical effect on expanding the institution of slavery in the United States. But finally, in 1808, when Congress is given the power to abolish the international slave trade, Congress does it. Yeah. And so that's the slave trade clause. And the last thing I'll just note here, just to put a capper on the convention itself, Jenna, is that ultimately, the delegates come together. They sign this new constitution on September 17th, 1787. 3 dissenters again refused to sign. That's Elbert Gary, Edmund Randolph, and George Mason. Ultimately, we have this huge ratification process that's governed by Article 7 of the Constitution that says once 9 states say yes to the new Constitution, it then goes into effect. The Constitution is finally ratified on June 21st, 1788, and it goes into effect with the meeting of the first Congress on March 4th, 1789.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tom. That was, again, a whirlwind. We are pretty much out of time. It's about 12:33. So thank you for taking us through those debates. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I've been trying to keep up with the questions in the chat. I'm no pro like Curry, but we did get a question in the Q&A, which is, how long did it take you to learn all of this, Tom?
It's a good question. It's something I've always been interested in American history, and so all my life I've been reading all of this, but I give most credit to my teachers in law school, in particular, Akil Amar and Bruce Ackerman taught me virtually everything I know about the Constitutional Convention. And if you're looking for a good single volume on the convention itself that's really readable, I still think Rick Beeman's Plain Honest Men. He was heavily, the late Rick Beeman was heavily involved in helping found the Constitution Center. He's a great historian at Penn. And his book remains just like a great single volume on the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, he was such a great teacher, and I loved working with him at the Constitution Center. And he was always just a great person to learn from and talk to. So, all right, well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, students, for joining us, and we will see you back here at 2:00 for our next session. So, thanks so much, everybody. Have a good day.
All right, thank you, everyone.